Okay, what I'm about to present today was actually an article that I published on East African Forum on July 27, 2000. That's 25 years ago. So the title of the article is Encounter with Isaias Afwerki and the Question of Assab. So I read, and then it may take about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. In 1989, Isaias Afwerki was in the United States, perhaps on an official visit, and came to New York and delivered the usual update on the developments of the EPLF struggle and the prospects of independence at the Interchurch Center, and I was invited to attend. He was accompanied, among others, by Ali Said and Hagos Gabrihiwat. The hall was packed with mostly scholars and professionals, and the many questions raised pertained to the struggle for liberation and general political and social issues that the EPLF advanced in the light of its political program. One question slightly different from the EPLF agenda, but nonetheless important, was whether the front has created some kind of conduit with the African American community. No satisfactory answer was given to that question. When the meeting was about to adjourn, and when the presiding chair announced the customary one final question call, I stood and raised my hand at the same time and was recognized by the chair. This was the fourth encounter with Isaias, the first two being at Ain and Baleqat at different times in the latter part of 1975, and the third was at Barca in 1978. Before I forwarded my question to him, I gave him the benefit of the doubt that he would recall our previous meetings and conversations, and then proceeded with my question. My question on the Assab controversy was definitely unexpected, but to me it was important because in anticipation of Eritrean independence, I was seriously concerned about the sudden shut-off of Ethiopia in terms of sea outlet, and I was candid and frank about it given my support to the Eritrean struggle of independence. This was the question verbatim I then forwarded to Isaias. Rumor has it that you are here to negotiate with the Derg government of Ethiopia in a peace initiative brokered by President Carter in Atlanta. I personally believe that Eritrean independence will be gained by the culmination of the armed struggle and not by negotiating with the Derg. However, if the negotiation is genuinely workable to your interests, you must bear in mind that once you sit in a round table, the principle of give and take becomes the modus operandi. Now, the Derg may put on the negotiating table the question of Assab and may demand from you the recognition of Assab as Ethiopian seaport. And what will be your response? The answer to my question was pure and simple. Are you saying that we must give up land in order to gain our independence? And by the time I attempted to clarify my position, I don't mean that. All I'm saying is, would you consider Assab as one of the negotiating items with the Ethiopian government? And then Isaias and his entourage were about ready to leave. My question, nevertheless, had already generated controversy in the informal discussions on Assab that continued outside the hall when the audience was dispersed. When I reached home, which is only a few blocks from the Interchurch Center, One Eritrean official called and extended some sort of apology for not rendering adequate answer to my question. Whatever the implication of that apology, I always had entertained, as indicated above, the question of outlet to the sea for Ethiopia, even in the presence of my Eritrean friends. The fact that Isaias responded in some furious fashion did not bother me either. He, after all, is the leader of the Eritrean independence movement, and evidently, of all people, his best friend and comrade, Ali Said, and Afar, was sitting beside him. At a personal level, he would not want to humiliate his friend, and at a broader political level, he could have been cautious not to preempt the forthcoming Atlanta negotiation. In any event, although Isaias is justified in defending Eritrean interests by giving no concession of sea outlet to Ethiopia, he should have been cognizant of the fact that Assab and Massawa would become meaningless unless Ethiopia uses them. I have made this position clear on a number of occasions. Africans like Richard Sherman have also risen in the same wavelengths. And most importantly, the EPLF and the EPRDF should have seriously considered the implication of a sudden lack of sea outlet for Ethiopia in 1991. Why did I ask that question some 25 years ago? And why are Ethiopians from different corners with various perspectives found as a factor so relevant at this juncture of Ethiopian history? A significant number of Ethiopians have attempted to diagnose the question of Assad and Ethiopia's legitimacy over the sea outlet from a historical and legal point of view. Many have even claimed that Assad is quintessentially Ethiopian in terms of geographic location and the geopolitical attributes, while others maintain that Assab in the first instance was ceded to an Italian Rubattino shipping company in 1869 and later illegally transferred to the Italian government. As a matter of course, I will first discuss the historical aspect of the discussion and then examine the legal dimension of this complex question on Assab. As I try to shed light and substantiate the relatively seasoned arguments, I want readers to bear in mind that historical claims, as we shall see below, are part and parcel of the legal or international law package. It's beyond the scope of this article to delve into history of antiquity, which indeed makes Eritrea as part of ancient Ethiopia or Aksum. But it is important to trace back some historical development, especially of the 19th century, when Eritrea itself was fashioned by Italians as a political entity. Long before the Italians came to Africa and a couple of years before the Rubattino bought Assab, a certain Antinori, a member of the Società Geografica Italiana, undertook an expedition to the Bay of Assab and the Bogos current area of Eritrea. According to the documents written by Società Geografica, both Assab and Bogos were considered as part of Ethiopia. During the entire period of Emperor Johannes and Ras Alula, 1871 to 1889, Eritrea was administered as part of Ethiopia, and Alula was governing the province from Asmara. But while Johannes' Ethiopia was being established as an incipient empire, European imperialism had begun in earnest in partitioning the African continent. Following the Rubattino, that is a decade later, the Italians appointed a commissioner to control the Bay of Assab, and in 1880, Rahita became Italian protectorate. In 1882, the Rubattino Company formally turned over the entire dominion to the Italian government. By the middle of the 1880s, the Italians had fully consolidated in the southern part and tip of the Red Sea. But in the middle of the 1880s, Johannes objected to their presence, let alone their colonial sovereignty over Assab and Rahita. And in 1884, the emperor concluded a treaty on behalf of Ethiopia with Great Britain. The treaty was known as Hewitt, representing Britain, or Adwa Treaty, because it was signed in Adwa, recognized as did the Società Geografica Italiana a decade and a half ago. Bogus, Massawa, and Highland Eritrea as part of Ethiopia. To Johannes' chagrin, however, the Italians occupied Massawa, Sahati in 1885, but were badly defeated by the Ethiopian forces of Alula at the Battle of Dogali in 1887. However, the Italians managed to rehabilitate themselves in August 1888 and hoisted their flag at Zula. Johannes and Alula were determined to keep the Italians at bay, if not destroy them. But historical circumstances were about to change dramatically and forever. Johannes was distracted by another invading foe from the Mahdis of the Sudan, and he was wounded and later beheaded at the Battle of Matamma in March 1889. In May of the same year, Menelik became Emperor of Ethiopia, and in August, the Italians led by Baldissera occupied Asmara. Eritrea was not created or formally established soon after the Baldissera forces settled in Asmara. And even after the Italians declared their colony on January 1, 1890, Eritrea did not have its present form yet. Initially, the Italians had occupied a mere triangle that connects Asmara, Seganeti, and Massawa. By December 21, 1893, General Baratiri, the new military governor of Eritrea, had managed to crush the Mahdist forces at Akodat. And by 1897-98, the entire western region, or Barca, was consolidated under Italian rule. Now, a major portion of highland Eritrea, including the areas from Seganeti to Sana'a, as well as part of Sarai, were joined to the original Italian triangle. With the full consolidation of the Italian colonialism over Eritrea, the limitations of frontiers was undertaken. In January 1900, and subsequently in July 1901, the boundary between the Protectorate of Rahita and the French Somaliland, Djibouti, was settled by the Visconti-Bensota-Barrere Agreement at Rome. And in May 1902, Rahita was formally annexed by the Italians and joined to the rest of Eritrea. Similarly, the borders between Ethiopia and Eritrea, as well as the Sudan, were marked by the respective boundary representatives. Major Chico di Colla for Italy, Colonel Harrington for Great Britain, and Emperor Menelik for Ethiopia. The agreement was written at Addis Ababa in May 1902 and finally ratified in 1907. However, Menelik had reservations on the Italians, and he already had declared the Treaty of Wuchale null and void beginning May 1894, that initially recognized Eritrea as Italian colony. And as a result, the borders between Ethiopia and Eritrea were not fully demarcated. And the question of outlet to the sea as Ethiopia's main concern would persist, as we shall see below. Although Menelik nullified the Treaty of Wuchale, he still wanted to maintain his friendship with Italy in the light of European hegemony over Africa and the growing distrust of the French by Ethiopians. Moreover, he wanted to continue the exemption for showing goods at Assab, as had been agreed by the Italians earlier. With the rise of Mussolini to power and fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935-36, the political scenario of the whole changed dramatically again. Mussolini will justify his occupation of Ethiopia by the so-called debellatio, or military conquest, and thus Italy declared its sovereignty over Ethiopia on May 9, 1936, and subsequently formed the Africa Orientale Italiana, by which Ethiopia was divided into Amhara, Harar, Oromo Sidama, Shoa, Tigray, with the exception of Aksum, was to be joined with Eritrea. The Africa Orientale Italiana was to be governed by the Ordinamento Politico Administrativo, but Ethiopians were determined to resist and struggle to maintain their independence. In the middle of the Ethiopian-Eritrean conflict, one Maurice Peterson, who represented the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and René Saint-Quentin, a French Africanist, met in Paris to possibly reconcile Mussolini's request with Haile Selassie's demand put before the League of Nations. As per Peterson and Saint-Quentin, it was not possible to meet Mussolini's demands because Tigray, the historic district of Ethiopia, cannot be incorporated into Eritrea. And Harar cannot be given away because it was Haile Selassie's birthplace. But if the plan worked out as per Mussolini's wishes, Italy was going to grant Ethiopia outlet to the sea via Assab. Following the Peterson-St. Quentin talks, another attempt of reconciliation between Ethiopia and Italy was initiated by the Grandi Vanzitari on November 26 and 29, and on December 3 and 5 of 1935. According to these talks, Ethiopia would set some areas in the Ogaden and Danakil in lieu of access to the sea via Assab. Another arbitration was taken by the Hor-Laval plan that would recognize Italy's sovereignty over Tigray, including Adigrat, Adwa, and Mekelle, with the exception of Aksum. Ethiopia was to be compensated with the secession of Assab with full Ethiopian sovereignty. But this plan, like other initiatives before it, proved to be a fiasco. Ethiopia rejected the Hor-Laval plan on grounds that in the event Mussolini escalates the war and occupies the whole empire of Ethiopia, there won't be any guarantee of national security. Mussolini was not discouraged by the failures of the many initiatives, and he still wanted to continue open and secret dialogue with Ethiopia, and thus talks between Rome and Addis Ababa again resumed in early 1936, with Afawar Ghebreyesus representing Ethiopia and Captain Stefano Mici representing Italy. At this point, Tigray was controlled by Italy, and this latest talk was going to recognize Haile Selassie's sovereignty over the non-occupied Ethiopian territories. Italy would have a mandate over Tigray and over parts of northern Somalia. And Ethiopia would own Assab on top of compensation of 1.5 billion lira for damage. None of the above initiatives, talks, and rapprochement worked out to reconcile Ethiopia's and Italy's requests and interests. But from historical point of view and national interest considerations, both Italy and Ethiopia seem to have fully recognized the significance of Assab as port of Ethiopia. Let's now examine the legal dimension or the international law aspect of the Assab factor. Legitimacy in this context will be discussed vis-à-vis the law of the sea, a branch of international law that was a customary law until it was codified by the United Nations Conference of 1958 and recodified ever since several times. Following Hugo Grotius' controversy with John Selden, students of international law saw the seas as belonging to everyone or to no one. Hence the concept of mare liberum, or the freedom of the seas. Unlike land, the seas could not be acquired by nations and made subject to particular nations' sovereignty, irrespective of the universal acceptance of the 3-mile belt of territorial waters for coastal states. Maritime jurisdiction is complex in that the law of the sea was made complicated by the addition of new concepts such as patrimonial or exclusive economic zone. But the principle of commonage or mare liberum prevailed. An offshoot and a good example of the freedom of the seas is the rules governing the seabed, which is made free of any jurisdiction whatsoever. From the standpoint of international law and history, one relevant law of the sea to Ethiopia's outlet to the sea, or the use of Assab as its port, is the recognition by extension of historic base by the Geneva Conference, as stipulated in Article 7.6 of the Convention on the Territorial Sea and Contiguous Zones. What is interesting about the Geneva Conference is that states can claim historic waters even if it did not meet the geographic criteria. Nations found historical evidence very persuasive, especially if it is coupled by the peaceful and continuous display of authority, which Ethiopia did for centuries over the waters of the Red Sea. Another important and relevant concept in the law of the sea is that what is known as right of innocent passage, by which all states, whether coastal or landlocked, enjoy the right of innocent passage through the territorial sea. Ethiopia, although it became landlocked with the advent of Eritrean independence in 1991, it is entitled to the passage and hence outlet to the sea. Moreover, as per the third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, April 1980, rights, jurisdiction, and duties of coastal states and other states in the exclusive economic zone are clearly delineated. Article 58, in particular, argues that all states without coastal or landlocked enjoy the freedom of the navigation and overflight, as well as the use of submarine cables for the operation of ships. Ethiopia, like other family of nations, can use the above provisions compatible with the convention. The right of the landlocked nations is further reinforced by the United Nations resolution of December 17, 1970, as declaration of principles governing the seabed and the ocean floor that will be open to all states, whether coastal or landlocked. Most importantly, the exploration of the seabed and the exploration of the resources shall be carried out for the benefit of mankind as a whole, irrespective of the geographical location of states, whether landlocked or COSAC. Considering the historical and legal parameters, as well as Ethiopia's national interest, it would seem sufficiently reasonable for Eritrea to accommodate Ethiopia on the question of Assab. If I were to encounter Isaias Afwerki for the 5th time, I would certainly ask him the same question, with slight modifications this time. Would you not recognize Ethiopia's use of Assab as outlet to the sea? Quite obviously, his response would be different too, except that he would not say, "Are you saying we should give up land in order to gain our independence?" Eritrea has already gained independence, but from its recent conflict with Ethiopia, I suspect it has learned its own lesson. The recognition of Assab as Ethiopia's port does not necessarily entail the contraction of Eritrean sovereignty. On the contrary, it may serve as an important leverage for reconciliation, peaceful coexistence, and even joint development projects in the long run. As to the Ethiopian government, the only piece of advice I want to extend is that the EPRDF, I say EPRDF because EPRDF was the government then, that did not exhibit consternation at the initial fall of Padme should not propitiate now, except in safeguarding Ethiopia's national interests. And by doing so, the Ethiopian government will seize an historic opportunity to rediscover the lacuna that made Ethiopia landlocked and altogether correct the deeply unbalanced set of ground rules that prevailed between Ethiopia and Eritrea from 1991 to 1998. Now it extends to 2025. The government has an obligation. Now the government has an obligation. It's not the EPRDF anymore. It's the government of Abiy Ahmed, or the Biltzegana party. It has an obligation to advocate for Ethiopia's national interest and forward an agenda that does not compromise Ethiopia's strategic interests. Okay? With this, I end. Thank you so much. And I say to all of you, please do support Cyberpower to Grind by sharing, by viewing, by liking, and by subscribing. Thank you.